The Zalthari Grand Admiral Virox floated in the command chamber of the dread Sovereign, the pride of the Empire's armada. Before him, holographic displays flickered with tactical readouts of the latest conquest. Another human colony, another insignificant species clinging to outdated weapons. He sighed, mandibles clicking in mild irritation. Humans, he mused aloud, so bold, so stubborn, yet so primitive. The War Council murmured in agreement. Humanity had only recently joined the interstellar stage, their technology laughable compared to the centuries-old advancements of the Zalthari. Their fleets relied on projectile-based weapons, an archaic concept. Plasma, ion, and neutron-based weaponry had long since rendered such things obsolete. One of his sub-commanders brought up an intercepted data file from the humans. It contained references to something called Project Iron Rain. Virox scoffed. The name alone was almost poetic in its desperation. "It matters not," he said, waving a claw dismissively. "Their colony will fall by day's end. Ready the fleet." On the surface of Orion 9, the colony's defense officers stood silently in a dark control room, watching the approaching Zalthari fleet. The holograms painted a grim picture. The largest Zalthari force ever deployed hovered above the planet. 3 dreadnoughts, 2 carrier ships, and at least a dozen destroyers. A full invasion force. Commander Evelyn Graves exhaled slowly. "They don't know," she murmured. Lieutenant Ortega grinned beside her. "No, they really don't." From orbit, the battle had already been decided. That's what the Zalthari thought, anyway. Their weapons were faster, their shields impenetrable to human ballistics. Every other species in the galaxy had adapted, abandoning kinetic weaponry for directed energy. Humanity, as always, had refused to play by the rules. Graves turned to her officers. "Start the sequence. Full charge." The command was relayed deep beneath the colony, to a subterranean bunker where ancient machines hummed to life. Giant capacitors, buried miles underground, crackled with raw energy. Rails, each spanning kilometers, began to glow. The air itself vibrated with the power being summoned. Project Iron Rain was online. In orbit, Admiral Virox observed the battlefield with calculated detachment. The human defense grid was laughable. Only a few automated rail turrets along the colony's perimeter. His forces had already disabled their satellites, ensuring no reinforcements would arrive. He gestured lazily to his tactical officer. "Begin the bombardment." The first wave of Zalthari fire rained down, lances of plasma scorching the upper atmosphere, energy bolts reducing human installations to molten slag. Explosions bloomed across the colony's outskirts. The humans had nothing to counter with, or so he thought. The first shot came without warning. A white-hot streak pierced the void, moving so fast it almost seemed like an error in the display. A Zalthari cruiser in the lower formation shuddered. A fraction of a second later, it shattered. The kinetic impact was instantaneous. No shields, no energy barriers. Nothing could stop it. The ship split apart like paper, its hull crumpling as if struck by the hand of a god. Virox bolted upright. What was that? Sensors struggled to track the projectile. It had been too fast, too precise. The Zalthari officers frantically scanned for the source. Another flash of light, another railgun round. This one punched clean through a destroyer, exiting through the other side before continuing into the void. No explosion, no heat signature, just destruction. This is impossible, one of the Zalthari engineers stammered. But the humans weren't done. A deep, rhythmic thrum echoed from the colony below. The planet itself seemed to tremble. One railgun was terrifying, but Iron Rain was not one gun. It was hundreds. Then the sky was torn apart. Hundreds of tungsten slugs, accelerated to hypersonic speeds, launched in synchronized intervals. Each one a tiny, unshielded chunk of metal, yet each hit with the force of a nuclear warhead. The Zalthari fleet, invincible just moments ago, collapsed into chaos. Their ships had never been designed for this kind of warfare. Plasma screens did nothing. Their countermeasures were irrelevant. Ships were pounded into oblivion before they could even maneuver. The battlefield was no longer space. It was a shooting gallery, and humanity never missed. 2 dreadnoughts down. Ortega whooped, scanning the data feeds. They're flailing. Graves watched impassively. She had no interest in gloating. This was war. This was survival. The galaxy had always assumed humanity was inferior. That assumption had been their greatest mistake, because humanity had never stopped perfecting kinetic warfare. Railguns had been an old relic, deemed inefficient by other species. But humans, they had spent centuries perfecting them, improving their velocity, their precision, their destructive yield. And now, they had mastered them. The colony's main rail battery recalibrated. A new target lock appeared. The Zalthari flagship. Admiral Virox was no fool. He had survived countless battles, crushed a dozen civilizations before this one. He knew when he was outmatched. His voice was tight with disbelief. Retreat. The order was given. What was left of his fleet turned tail, engines burning at full thrust. The Zalthari had come to exterminate a weak, primitive species. Instead, they had walked into annihilation. Humanity had rewritten the rules of war, not with advanced energy weapons, not with hypertech shields or exotic quantum disruptors, just metal slugs, fired faster than anything in the galaxy could comprehend. As the last Zalthari ship jumped to FTL, a single message was sent from the colony to the fleeing enemy. A simple, ancient phrase: mass times acceleration. The retreating remnants of the Zalthari fleet limped into the void, their once proud formation now a fractured mess of wreckage and broken ships. The devastation left by the human railguns was absolute. Admiral Virox sat in stunned silence aboard his damaged flagship, mandibles clenched in frustration. He had led countless invasions, crushed civilizations that had stood for millennia, but nothing had ever done this to his forces. His officers hesitated, awaiting orders. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. The humans had unleashed something unthinkable, something outside the known laws of modern warfare. The Zalthari had dismissed kinetic weapons as outdated and ineffective. They had been wrong. Virox exhaled sharply. Deploy the suppression fleet. A moment of hesitation. Then his command was relayed. 5 additional war groups, reinforcements that had been held in reserve, emerged from FDL, positioning themselves just outside of the human colony's planetary defense grid. This time, they came prepared. If brute force had failed, then adaptability would have to win the day. The Zalthari were not just conquerors. They were survivors. Their empire had thrived for centuries because they learned from their enemies, studied their weaknesses, and evolved. Humanity had surprised them once. It would not happen again. The suppression fleet engaged its energy dampeners, massive wave emitters designed to disrupt electromagnetic systems. These were the same devices used to disable planetary defense grids of other species, rendering them helpless. If the humans relied on their prized railguns, all Virox had to do was cripple their ability to fire. A new confidence settled over the Zalthari fleet. This time, humanity would not escape annihilation. On Orion 9, Graves and her team watched as a second fleet emerged on their tactical displays. Their victory had been swift, but it had also been loud. The Zalthari now understood their mistake and had returned with numbers. And worse, they had adapted. Energy dampeners, Ortega muttered, watching the interference spread through their systems. They're scrambling our targeting solutions. Graves grimaced. This wasn't unexpected. The Zalthari had the most advanced suppression technology in the known galaxy, and now they were deploying it against railguns. The pulse waves wouldn't disable them completely, but they would reduce accuracy, slow targeting speeds, and disrupt automated firing solutions. The raw power of a railgun meant nothing if it missed its target. Virox's voice echoed across an open comms channel, his tone smug. Human commander, I admit your strategy was surprising, but now you will see the futility of resisting the inevitable. Your weapons are primitive, your tactics flawed, and now you will be crushed as so many before you. Graves didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Instead, she acted. Switch to manual targeting, she ordered. Override AI calibration. I want human operators on every gun. Ortega blinked. That'll kill our accuracy even more. Railguns rely on predictive firing models, and our computers are useless now. But we aren't. A quiet realization settled over the control room. The Zalthari had countered automated warfare, but humanity had never relied on AI to win wars. Across the colony, trained operators took control. Men and women with years of experience, battle-hardened soldiers, now manually guiding the same weapons that had obliterated the First Fleet. The difference between humans and machines was simple. A machine only saw data. A human saw intent. A machine predicted movement logically. A human felt the battle. The Zalthari suppression fleet advanced, their commanders confident in their newfound advantage. They closed in, their plasma batteries charging, preparing to launch a planetary-scale bombardment. The colony's shield grid was failing. If the railguns didn't respond soon, the entire planet would be reduced to molten slag. The first railgun fired. This time, it wasn't a precise, calculated shot. It wasn't guided by an AI-assisted firing solution. It was raw instinct. A human operator, trusting gut feeling and experience, leading the shot by just enough. The round slammed into a Zalthari battleship, tearing through the hull. The ship didn't explode. Instead, the sheer force of impact caused it to bend, its own structural integrity failing before its reactor could even detonate. The second shot came seconds later, a destroyer in mid-maneuver, attempting to dodge. It was too slow. The slug clipped the rear engines, sending it spiraling uncontrollably into a nearby cruiser. The two ships collided, breaking apart in a shower of debris. Virox felt a cold chill settle over him. His dampeners were working, but it wasn't enough. The humans had abandoned precision and turned their railguns into artillery cannons, firing massive barges instead of pinpoint shots. They had adapted faster than he had. On the surface, Graves monitored the data streams. The railguns were only 40% as effective as before, but 40% was still enough. The battlefield had become chaos, and chaos was where humans thrived. The Zalthari, trained in calculated formations and mathematical precision, struggled to counter an enemy that refused to fight with predictable patterns. The railgun operators fired at irregular intervals, forcing enemy ships into erratic movements, and the more they dodged, the easier it became to predict their next step. Ortega's voice was urgent. We've got a clear shot at their command ship. Graves didn't hesitate. Fire everything we have. The colony's 3 largest rail batteries, their capacitors burning white-hot, discharged simultaneously. 3 rounds, each the size of a small building, launched at incomprehensible speeds. Virox saw it coming. He tried to react, to issue evasive maneuvers, but the moment had already passed. The human operators had fired not at his ship, but at where his ship was about to be. No amount of technology, no amount of shielding, no amount of calculation could stop the fundamental laws of physics. The first round hit the bow, splitting the ship's armored plating like a brittle shell. The second round punched through the center, severing internal power grids. The third and final round struck the ship's reactor core. The dread Sovereign, the most powerful warship in the Zalthari fleet, was ripped apart in seconds. Virox never had time to scream. The surviving Zalthari forces, leaderless and in complete disarray, broke formation. They scattered in all directions, desperate to escape the slaughter. Some ships tried to fight back, but they were outgunned, outmatched, and outclassed. Humanity wasn't fighting a war anymore. They were ending one. The remnants of the Zalthari fleet fled in a chaotic scramble, abandoning their dead and dying as they vanished into the depths of space. Their empire had never known defeat on this scale. Never faced an enemy that could turn technological inferiority into dominance. The silence that followed was suffocating, an absence of the usual victorious Zalthari war chants, the triumphant transmissions of another world conquered. Humanity had not just survived. They had won. On Orion 9, relief was brief. The battle was over, but war was never about a single engagement. Graves stood at the command center, exhaustion creeping in, but her mind was already racing ahead. The Zalthari would return. Maybe not today, maybe not even this year, but they wouldn't forget. Empires built on war never did. Ortega broke the silence. We just made history, you know that. Graves exhaled. Yeah, and history has consequences. Every major power in the galaxy had just witnessed what had happened. Surveillance drones, long-range scanners, intelligence networks. Word would spread. The Zalthari weren't the only empire in the void, and every one of them would now look at humanity with new eyes. Some would be afraid, others would be curious, and a few, the worst kind, would see it as a challenge. There was no hiding what had happened here. Humanity had been underestimated for centuries, dismissed as primitive. They had just proven that assumption wrong in the loudest way possible. Across human space, the impact was immediate. Military command centers erupted in urgent strategy meetings, analysts poring over every detail of the battle. The footage of Zalthari dreadnoughts crumbling under railgun fire was already spreading, studied by generals and politicians alike. The colonies cheered. The fleet officers raised toasts. But the veterans, the ones who had seen wars before, only tightened their grips on their weapons. Because if humanity had mastered one thing, it was this: victory invites retaliation. The first transmissions came within hours. The Ogren Dominion, an empire known for its brutal pragmatism, sent a diplomatic inquiry, neutral, but clearly testing the waters. The Vari Concordance, longtime enemies of the Zalthari, congratulated humanity and subtly asked about potential military exchanges. Even the normally silent core worlds, the oldest and most isolationist species in the galaxy, took notice. The Zalthari, however, said nothing. That silence was more unnerving than threats. Humanity had forced them into an impossible situation. To acknowledge the defeat meant showing weakness to the galaxy, a risk that no empire could afford. But to ignore it would be even worse. The Zalthari Empire had stood for centuries as an unstoppable force, an empire that crushed resistance before it could grow. And now, against all logic, a species with no shields, no energy weapons, no FDL disruptors had done the unthinkable. Every human leader knew what that meant. The Zalthari would never accept this loss. They would come back with a force so overwhelming, so devastating, that humanity would never rise again. There would be no more arrogance in their attack, no underestimating the power of kinetic warfare. Next time, they would bring their entire war machine. Graves knew this too. She had spent years studying how empires operated, how they thought. The Zalthari had been caught off guard, but they were not stupid. Their response would be calculated, and it would be merciless. So humanity had to prepare. Now, the first decision was made before the battle reports had even finished circulating. Every colony, every military outpost, every hidden station along the edges of human space began immediate weapons production. Railgun technology, once seen as an outdated relic, was now the keystone of survival. The plans for Orion 9's planetary defense system were sent to every major human world. Scientists and engineers optimized the designs, improving recharge rates, refining targeting algorithms, increasing projectile speeds. The weaknesses exposed by the energy dampeners were analyzed and countermeasures were devised. The fleet adapted, too. Humanity's navy had always been smaller than the galactic superpowers, but that was about to change. New warships were planned, fast, heavily armed, built around railgun technology instead of energy weapons. Every available shipyard was repurposed, every resource redirected. The old rules of space combat had been shattered. Humanity wasn't going to rebuild them. They were going to write new ones. And then something unexpected happened. The first offers arrived from mercenaries, from independent factions, even from defectors within other species' fleets. The footage of the battle had done more than terrify the Zalthari. It had inspired those who had spent their lives fearing the Empire. A Zalthari commander, one of Virox's own officers, sent a discreet transmission. His words were simple. "They will never let this stand. I will not die for a fool's pride. We should talk." It wasn't an alliance, not yet, but it was the start of something. For the first time, the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, not because of diplomacy, not because of hidden deals or ancient prophecies, because humanity had taken a simple truth, mass times acceleration, and weaponized it beyond anyone's understanding. Now the question wasn't whether they could defend themselves. It was whether the galaxy could keep up. The meeting was held in secret. No official records. No diplomatic courtesies. Just a room filled with people who understood that the galaxy had changed. Representatives from human colonies, military commanders, intelligence operatives, all gathered around a single undeniable truth. The Zalthari would return. And when they did, they would not come with arrogance. They would come with annihilation. A holographic display flickered, showing projections of possible invasion routes. The Zalthari had countless fleets, but now humanity knew their limitations. They relied on overwhelming force, on fear, on enemies breaking before the battle even began. That had worked for centuries, but it wouldn't work now, because humanity had looked them in the eye and did not break. Graves leaned forward, voice steady. "We can't fight them ship for ship. We can't match their numbers. But we don't need to." She gestured to the display, highlighting weak points in Zalthari supply chains. Their empire was vast, too vast. Its strength was also its weakness. Massive fleets required massive logistics. They had grown comfortable, accustomed to enemies folding before supply lines even became an issue. Humanity wasn't going to give them that luxury. "We don't play their game," she continued. "We changed the rules. The first step was mobility. The Zalthari fought like an empire, slow, methodical, crushing anything in their path, that worked against civilizations that fought defensively. Humanity would fight like something else entirely. Raids, sabotage, precision strikes. They wouldn't try to hold territory. They would make every Zalthari advance costly. The more ground the Empire took, the harder it would be to keep. Supply depots, command stations, shipyards. Everywhere the Zalthari needed stability, humanity would bring chaos. The next step was technology. Railguns had proven their worth, but there was still more to refine. Every military research team was already working on next-generation kinetic weapons, higher velocity rounds, adaptive payloads, stealth-based coil guns that could fire undetected until impact. The Zalthari had underestimated humanity once. They wouldn't get the chance to do it again. And then there was a wild card. The growing network of defectors, rebels, and opportunists. The Zalthari had ruled through fear, but fear only worked when people believed resistance was impossible. Orion 9 had shattered that illusion. Now, whispers of defiance were spreading. An intercepted transmission played. A Zalthari officer, speaking in hushed tones. The humans were supposed to be weak. We were told they had no future. But they fought like nothing we've ever seen. We have been lied to. The Empire is not invincible. It was just one voice. But one voice could become many. The Zalthari knew this too. Their silence in the days following the battle wasn't just shock. It was damage control. If the truth spread too fast, their own people might start asking questions. And an empire that had to justify itself was an empire already starting to crack. So humanity would help it crack faster. Covert teams were already infiltrating Zalthari networks, planting evidence, spreading carefully curated footage. Not propaganda, just truth. The images of Zal Theri warships breaking apart, their mightiest dreadnought crumbling under human firepower, the fear in the voices of their retreating commanders. The galaxy had spent centuries believing the Zal Theri were unstoppable. That belief was dying, and when belief dies, so does control. The Zal Theri would still come. The war was far from over, but it would not be the war they had planned for. They would arrive expecting a desperate, defensive humanity. What they would find instead was a species evolving, a species that had studied them, learned from them, and adapted faster than they ever thought possible. They would find a humanity that had embraced its greatest strength, not technology, not numbers, but the simple, undeniable truth that when you knock a human down, they don't stay down. They get back up, and they hit back even harder.